Good morning, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Valerie Gordon. I'm the president of the CEI, and I'm pleased to, represent the CEI this morning in collaboration with ALNAP, presenting the second part of Monitoring and Evaluation for Humanitarian Action series. This session is called Adapting the OECD Criteria for the Evaluation of Humanitarian Action. We have our distinguished facilitators here, Sarah Garby and May Albiento, and the colleagues, Waramu and Homan, which are providing support. So we're in for a very informative session. I would just start as we usually do by asking persons to quickly introduce themselves. I see some have put in the chat already, but if I call on you, just quickly introduce yourselves and or when I call on you, and we can move ahead while the others join us. All right, I'm gonna start with ALNAP Comms, Waramu.
Hello, my name is Warimo Njau. I am based in Kenya. I am ALNAP's Digital Communications Manager and helping Sarah and May with the tech. And thank you for joining. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Homam.
Hi, everyone. My name is Homam, and I'm the Digital Engagement Officer at ALNAP, and I wish you a great training session.
Thanks, Homam. Cher, can you speak? Curleen. Oh, is everybody muted?
Yes, Valerie, they have to unmute themselves.
Oh, yeah, please unmute yourselves. Jan, please go ahead.
Good day, everyone. My name is Jan Voordouw. I'm an independent consultant and member of CEI, based in Jamaica, but I was involved in humanitarian action in Haiti for quite a while.
Thanks, Jan. Anne, I know you're on the road.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Anne Bramble, an independent evaluator, member of CEI on the board. I wish us all a great session.
Thanks, and Melanie.
Sorry, I'm coming. Sorry. Hi, Melanie here. I'm independent evaluator, monitor, auditor, currently based in the UK. Looking forward to a great session today also. Thanks.
Thanks, Melanie. Winston, I see Winston.
Yeah, Winston Anderson, M&E specialist, based in Jamaica, which we also have a very good seminar, a webinar this morning. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks. Cher, are you ready? Not yet. Curleen. Oh. All right, Melissa.
Good morning, everyone. Melissa March from Arbor West Consulting. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Pauline.
Good morning, everyone. I am Pauline Gregory Lewis, and I am a member of CEI, and I'm in Jamaica.
Thanks, Pauline. Sharika.
Good morning, everyone. Sharika Rogers here. Sorry, I'm down with the flu. I typed in the chat.
Okay, thank you. I hope you get better soon. Stacey and Austin.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Stacey Ann Austin from the University of the West Indies Disaster Risk Reduction Center. I am the DRM Technical Programming Associate. I'm really looking forward to the insights that we'll all garner from this session this morning. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Welcome, welcome. Suzanne.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Susan Branca Green. I'm a member of CEI and also vice president. And I'm joining from Barbados and really, really looking forward to today's session. Thank you so much, Valerie.
Thank you. Terrence, welcome.
Hello, Valerie and everyone.
Yeah.
My name is Terrence Jancy. I'm a senior evaluation advisor for the Cantera Group, and Valerie had mentioned this exercise happening, and so I was curious to come and listen in.
Yes, Terence is a very distinguished evaluator and teaching us a lot about evaluation in crisis moments. Valessa, good to see you. Morning.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I am Valessa Johnson from Trinidad and Tobago. I am a research and policy officer. I work specially with the monitoring and evaluation section in my ministry, which is the Office of the Attorney General. So it's a pleasure to meet you all.
Great, thank you. Thanks. Good to have you. Who did I see just now? Alexandra.
Hi everyone, I'm Alexandra, an independent evaluator consultant. I have over 10 years of experience working for humanitarian responses, mainly with Save the Children International. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you, thank you. All right, I don't know if maybe Caroline and Cher can just put your introductions in the chat and we'll move right along. I'm handing over to Nadini, who will introduce May. And she will introduce herself also.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nadini, and I'm the Director of Professional Development at CEI and also Senior Lecturer in Evaluation at the University of the West Indies, Barbados. May joined ALNAP in 2022. She has more than a decade of experience in the humanitarian and development sector in the Philippines. She worked as an evaluation and research consultant for local and international NGOs focusing on child protection, gender and women empowerment, livelihoods and disaster response and management. May's education background is in evaluation, public policy and management, development studies, and psychology. So I'll now hand over to May. Over to you, May.
Thanks so much, Valerie and Nadini. I hope my audio is working. Good morning, everyone. Happy to be joining you today from Manila. Before we dive into our session today, we have a poll question that we want you to answer. Wairimu, could you please? Okay, we have 7 people who've answered. Oh, someone said the poll disappeared. Wairimu. I'm not sure what happened. So if you don't see the poll in your screen, you could also share your answer in the chat. So how familiar are you with OECD evaluation criteria? So the options are not at all, some familiarity, and very familiar. Okay, has it been a minute? Okay, it came back. Good.
35 seconds, but I think everyone has answered.
Okay, so let's see the results. Where we move? Can you all see the results now? 6 out of the 9 who responded to the question are very familiar. 2 has some familiarity, and 1 is not familiar with the OECD criteria. Okay, thanks everyone for participating in the poll. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so just to give you a glimpse of what today's session will look like, we will start with some background on the topic. Then we'll proceed with a discussion of the criteria and the priority themes that we need to consider when evaluating humanitarian action as set out in the updated ALNAP guide. And then we'll go into breakout groups for some practice exercises. Just a couple of reminders before we proceed further. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be posted later on YouTube. We request that you please keep your microphones turned off while the presentation is ongoing. You may also opt to keep your videos off if you have poor connection to save on bandwidth. You will have a chance to turn on your microphones and video during the group work. And if you have any questions, kindly put them in the chat and our speaker will respond to them after her presentation. And lastly, please have a copy of the ALNAP evaluation criteria available on your laptop or on your phone, as you will need it for the group work later. My colleague Wairimu here will post a link to the guide in the chat if you don't have a copy of that yet. There you go. Now, for those who are not familiar with ALNAP yet, we are the global network for advancing humanitarian learning. Our goal is for all humanitarians to benefit from the sector's collective experience. ALNAP stands for Active Learning Network for Accountability and Performance in Humanitarian Action. It was created to support humanitarians everywhere to improve humanitarian action by exchanging evidence, experience, and practical ideas. The network is made up of about 100 members, including national and international NGOs, UN agencies, Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement members, also bilateral and multilateral donor organizations, networks, academics, and think tanks. ALNAP is known for producing M&E guides or evaluation guides, to be precise. These include the Evaluating Humanitarian Action, or the EHA guide, which is probably the most popular one, published in 2016. We also have the Evaluation of Protection and Humanitarian Action Guide, published in 2018. You can find these guides and our other M&E resources on our website, but Wairimu will also share the links to the two guides in the chat. But our focus today is on our updated guide on adapting the OECD criteria for the evaluation of humanitarian action, initially published in 2016 and updated recently, just last year. Our main facilitator for this session is Sarah Garby. She is a research fellow at ALNAP with nearly 20 years of experience in the humanitarian and development sectors. She has worked with the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, several international INGOs, and the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement as an evaluation advisor, researcher, and evaluator. She is the co-author of this guide, the Adapting the OECD Criteria for the Evaluation of Humanitarian Action. Before I turn over the floor to Sarah, let's watch the short video clip about the guide.
Humanitarian crises are becoming more frequent, more complex, and more interconnected. In this context, evaluation isn't optional, it's essential. It helps us understand what's working, what isn't, and what needs to change. That's why ALNAP has developed a new guide, Adapting the OECD Criteria for the Evaluation of Humanitarian Action. This guide is complementary to the OECD guidance and an update of ALNAP's 2006 publication, which for nearly 2 decades has helped shape how evaluation is done in humanitarian settings. Since 2006, the humanitarian landscape has changed dramatically. Crisis contexts are more protracted, power imbalances are under greater scrutiny, and evaluators are being asked tougher questions about learning, accountability, and whose voices are being heard. This new guide responds to those challenges. It's based on a wide-ranging participatory process that involved hundreds of evaluation professionals and stakeholders across languages, regions, and organizations. So what does the guide do? At its core, it helps you adapt the OECD evaluation criteria in a way that is relevant, useful, and realistic for humanitarian action. It covers 7 key criteria: relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, coherence, coverage and inclusion, and interconnection. Each criterion has been updated, redefined, and in one case renamed to reflect current humanitarian realities and challenges. You will find new guidance on when and how to apply each one, and how to avoid using them rigidly and generically, because not every criterion applies to every evaluation. Instead, the guide encourages flexible, purposeful use grounded in what evaluation users need to know. As the guide puts it, fit the evaluation questions to the criteria, not the other way around. The guide also draws attention to the power dynamics and positionality that influence evaluations and how criteria are interpreted. Whose knowledge counts? Who decides what gets evaluated and how? And who defines success? And so, under each criteria, the guide introduces shifting the lens, power, and positionality. These prompts encourage evaluators to reflect on what is evaluated, how and by whom, inviting shifts that enhance the fairness, accuracy, and relevance of evaluation process and findings. The guide also recognizes that evaluation can do more than improve performance. It can help drive real transformational change in the sector. To support that, it introduces 3 priority themes. These came directly from what people told us during the consultation process. Issues that kept coming up where the humanitarian system needs to do better, and where evaluation can really make a difference. 1. Putting people affected by crisis at the center. 2. Locally led humanitarian action. 3. The environment and climate crisis. These themes can be evaluated on their own or integrated into the criteria. So how do you use the guide? It's designed to be flexible. You can read it start to finish to build foundational knowledge, or dip into it as a reference when designing or managing an evaluation. Each chapter includes a definition, key messages, methodology notes, links to humanitarian principles, examples of evaluation, and reflections on power and positionality. The guide emphasizes intentional, informed selection based on context and purpose. And while affected people may not always be users of evaluations, they are always key stakeholders. This guide promotes thoughtful inclusion of their perspectives throughout the process. So who is this guide for? It's for evaluators, commissioners, practitioners, students, and anyone seeking to strengthen humanitarian evaluation. Whether you are brand new to evaluation or have decades of experience, this guide gives you clarity on using the criteria in humanitarian settings and food for thoughts on a range of key issues relating to the evaluation of a humanitarian action. It uses accessible language, supports learning and accountability, and adapts to real-world constraints. Our guide, Adapting the OECD Criteria for the Evaluation of Humanitarian Action, is available now at alnap.org. Use it, share it, and let it support better evaluation and stronger, more accountable humanitarian action.
My name is Sarah Garby, and I'll be taking you through the rest of the session. Thank you so much to May, Nadini, and Valerie for introducing this session. I'm very happy to be with you today. Happy to see some new faces, but also some faces from the old familiar faces from our first session back in January. As May mentioned, I'm one of the 3 co-authors of this guide, and I'll be taking you through some of the key elements of the guide. We'll have time for group work, but obviously there's a lot of technical details and granular information available in the guide that I invite you to continue discovering after this session by downloading the guide and using it in your daily practice. I'll start my part of this session with some key definitions of key terms. For those of you who were in the first session a month ago, those will be familiar, but I think it's important to kind of frame what we're talking about today. First of all, humanitarian action. It will be a recurring theme throughout the session. And we, at ALNAP, we define humanitarian action as all actions with the objectives to protect and save lives, to alleviate suffering and maintain human dignity during and the aftermath of crisis, as well as to prevent and strengthen preparedness for the occurrence of such situations. So obviously humanitarian action is different from development work or other long-term work like peace building, and that it really links to both short-term and more protracted crises. And that means that humanitarian contexts are quite specific in nature and also poses some challenges both for humanitarian workers but also for evaluators. The second definition I just wanted to quickly introduce today is the definition of evaluation of humanitarian action, which we at ALNAP have a tendency to abbreviate and just say EHA. So apologies in advance if I'm going to use the acronym EHA a lot. So EHA stands for the Evaluation of Humanitarian Action and is the systematic and objective examination of humanitarian action to determine the worth or significance of an activity, policy, or program, with the intention to draw lessons to improve policy and practice and enhance accountability. As May mentioned, if you have any questions on what I'm presenting, please put those in the chat and I'll do my best to answer your questions during group work in written. So please, if any of my slides elicit reflections, comments, or questions, please put those in the chat. Next slide, please. So this training session is very much focused on the content of the guide. This guide was published in September last year and is an update of ALNAP's 2006 guide, Evaluating Humanitarian Action Using the OECD Criteria. The 2006 guide was one of our most popular evaluation guides, and it took us 5 years, believe it or not, to update the 2006 guide. It was a long process, it was evidence-informed, and it was participatory. It was very important for us to base the development of the new guide on input from the evaluation community, from diverse stakeholders, and to really ensure that the new guide is as useful as possible to a broader audience. Now, I saw in the poll that most of you are familiar with the OECD criteria. So you might wonder why this guide when there is such comprehensive guidance from the OECD on the evaluation criteria already. Well, the OECD, the most up-to-date OECD criteria does apply their criteria on humanitarian action as well, but their guidance is not super detailed when it comes to how the criteria are supposed to be used in humanitarian context. And that's why we felt like there would be an added value of developing new guidance. I'll shortly also take you through the history of the criteria, and that will provide maybe also some clarity on why we decided to publish this guide. Our guide does not in any way replace the OECD guidance. On the contrary, we think it complements the OECD guidance. So if you have time, I invite you to also explore the OECD guidance if you haven't already. Our guide is intended for evaluators of humanitarian action, but also those involved in commissioning, designing, and managing evaluation of humanitarian action. Next slide, please. This is my favorite slide, but I'm a bit of a criteria nerd these days and also a history nerd. Humam, this is going to be multi-step. So yes, this is the first step. So as some of you might know, the 5 original OECD criteria were effectiveness, relevance, efficiency, impact, and sustainability. They were established all the way back in 1991 by the OECD DAC. Next step. Yes, and so in the 90s, there was a lot of debates on whether or not these 5 original criteria were appropriate and relevant for the evaluation of humanitarian action. And there was a lot of different papers that were published, and some of those papers were based on experiences from humanitarian response after the genocide in Rwanda. And in 1998 and 1999, 2 papers were published in tandem by ODI and by the OECD DAC. ODI is a think tank based in London, which incidentally also hosts ALNAP, so we are strongly linked to ODI. These 2 papers actually suggested different criteria for the evaluation of humanitarian action. Some were maintained, but a few additional criteria were proposed. Those were coverage and coherence, appropriateness was added to relevance, and sustainability was replaced with connectedness. So there was a whole new set of criteria that was proposed for the evaluation of humanitarian action. Humam, next. And so in 2006, we published a guide using these additional criteria, but also providing guidance on effectiveness, relevance, efficiency, and impact. It drew on the papers from 1998 and 1999, but it further developed the guidance. There's sometimes a misconception that the criteria that we proposed in the 2006 guide were ALNAP criteria, but in fact they were not. These were criteria that had been developed in the 90s, as I mentioned. And so our guide in 2006 just built on those papers from the 90s. Next step. And then to complicate things a little bit, the OECD developed and updated their criteria in 2019. So whilst in 1991, when the 5 original OECD DAC criteria were developed, those were developed for development work. And then obviously, as I just explained, additional criteria were developed for EHA. In 2019, the OECD, based on consultation, decided to merge all of these criteria in a set of 6 criteria that are supposed to be used not only for development work or development evaluations, but also for humanitarian evaluation and peace building evaluations. So they maintained the 5 original ones and then added coherence. So coherence was kind of included from the list of the additional criteria that had been developed for EHA. So the OECD now has 6 core criteria, the 5 original ones plus coherence, and coverage and connectedness were not maintained as part of the core menu of criteria. You will see why this is important in the next slide, maybe. Hold on. Yes. So if we go back to our guide, there's a lot of different elements in our guide. So apologies in advance for this figure that might be a bit overwhelming. At the core of the guide is obviously the evaluation criteria. We have relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, coherence, and impact, which are part of the suite of the official OECD criteria. Then we also decided to, based on the feedback that we received, to maintain coverage, but we added inclusion to coverage. And we also maintained connectedness that we renamed interconnection, just because we got a lot of feedback that connectedness was not a great name for a criterion. It was difficult to understand and difficult to translate. So in our current guide, we have 7 criteria. You might wonder what happened to sustainability. We decided that we would not include sustainability as one of the official humanitarian criteria, but that it's a subsection under interconnection. In addition to the core criteria that we provide guidance on, we also included something that we call priority themes. And those are additional lenses to support transformational change. These are 3 themes: putting affected people at the center, locally led humanitarian action, and environment and climate crisis. Those are themes that very heavily were put forward in the consultation phase of the development of the guide as key themes for the future of the humanitarian sector. And that without considering these themes, the humanitarian sector would become less relevant, essentially. So we really emphasize these three themes throughout the guide, not only as sub-themes in the criteria chapters, but also as standalone themes. Then we also have a few other additional concepts that we consider in the guide. The humanitarian principles. I will not get into that much today, but if you're interested, please explore that in the guide. We can describe how each criteria can be linked to the humanitarian principles, which are very important for humanitarian action. There is a second set of potential standard that can be used for evaluations, and that is used by some organizations when they do humanitarian evaluation, and that's the core humanitarian standard. So we also, in an annex, explore the links between the core humanitarian standard and the evaluation criteria. And then we do have some cross-cutting issues. We do not emphasize those that much, but there is an annex with a few additional cross-cutting issues. As I'm sure you know, there is such a wide range of cross-cutting issues that are used by different organizations, and it just did not seem feasible for us to provide comprehensive guidance on all of the cross-cutting issues. But there is information in an annex on 3 of them. And then finally, the last element or dimension that we include in the guide, which is very important, is a section called Shifting the Lens, Power and Positionality, which addresses all issues related to bias, to decolonization, to power dynamics. And so for each evaluation criteria, we have a short section exploring how biases and power dynamics can impact the interpretation of the different criteria. So that was a lot of information, but we'll take the rest of the session to kind of explore the different criteria and to deconstruct this slide. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have 7 evaluation criteria. I think most of you will be familiar with those that are still part of the OECD DAC criteria, and that's relevance, efficiency, impact, effectiveness. Overall, the definitions for these 5 criteria don't differ that much from the OECD guidance. I would say that the biggest difference is probably for coherence. So coherence is included both in our guide and in the OECD DAC guide, but we have adapted the coherence definition quite a lot, and I'll dig into coherence quite a lot more later on in this session. For relevance, we're really focusing the definition on affected people and if humanitarian action is doing the right things for affected people. Perhaps more than the official OECD DAC guidance, we're really zeroing in on how relevant the action is for affected people. Efficiency has 3 dimensions. Those are all the same as the OECD DAC guidance. And impact, always a challenging criterion, but just as in development, maybe even more than in development work, we really only recommend using impact if there's applying impact as a criterion, if there's enough resources and enough time to do a proper analysis. What might stand out to you here are the 2 criterion in the middle, which are coverage and inclusion and interconnection. Coverage and inclusion focuses on reach. So who does humanitarian action reach and how does this relate to need, including protection need? Protection is a very important dimension of humanitarian action. And then the second criterion, which is specific to EHA, the evaluation of humanitarian action, is interconnection, which as a reminder was used to be called connectedness. And here we really focus on how humanitarian connection is connected to the longer term and the medium term in the environment where the humanitarian action is taking place, are the longer term and medium term activities taken into account in the design and planning and implementation of humanitarian action? And how does it connect with development and peace building? We'll take a look at these two specifically, two specific humanitarian criteria a bit later in the session. Next slide, please. So in this session, I have chosen to focus on 4 criteria. And so there are 3 criteria that we will not examine and explore in detail today. And those are effectiveness, efficiency, and impact. Overall, as I mentioned before, the definitions are in alignment with the OECD definition. There are some challenges which are specific to the evaluation of humanitarian action for each of these criteria, and they are explored in the guide. And in the guide, we'll also find good practice examples of how you can apply these criteria in humanitarian action. Overall, I would say that the common thread throughout the criteria, and maybe even more, as I mentioned in the OECD doc, we really encourage evaluators and commissioners to put affected people at the center of the evaluation for all criteria. That means exploring how effectiveness is perceived and experienced by affected people, how efficiency and impact are perceived and experienced by affected people. And so there's lots more information in the guide on these 3 criteria, but I thought these 3 criteria are those that people are usually most familiar with. And in the interest of time, we just didn't have time to go through all 7. Next slide, please. So the first criteria that we will take a look at a bit more in detail today is relevance. For each criterion, we pose a question that kind of tries to summarize what is at the key of the criterion. And for relevance, that question is humanitarian action doing the right things? The definition, the way we opted to define relevance is the following. Relevance refers to whether humanitarian action is in line with the needs and priorities of people affected by crisis in each specific context, and with the needs and priorities of institutions, partners at macro and micro levels. So this means that relevance not only examines if the relevance of humanitarian action at micro level, which could be how the action is planned and designed, but also at micro levels. Are the specific activities relevant for affected people? Are the choices of services provided relevant for affected people? Next slide, please. And the second criterion that I wanted us to examine a bit more today is coverage and inclusion. The question that we pose with coverage and inclusion is, who does humanitarian action reach, and how does this relate to humanitarian need, including protection? Coverage is a criterion which is specific to humanitarian action, and it means exploring which members and groups within the affected population have been reached through humanitarian action. Reach is really a key word for coverage and inclusion. And you cannot assess reach without understanding humanitarian needs. We opted to also add inclusion to coverage because it means that, or because we really wanted to have a multi-dimensional analysis of coverage. So it means not only understanding how many have been reached, but who. Has humanitarian action reached people without discrimination? And that could be on the basis of nationality, race or ethnicity, gender, religious belief, class, disability, sexual identity, and orientation. But it also means if the specific and diverse needs of these different groups have been addressed. So depending on the humanitarian action and the context, some groups might have very specific needs. So the coverage and inclusion criterion really poses the question, who has been reached have all relevant groups been reached, and have their specific needs been met through humanitarian action? Next slide, please. Yes. So now we'll get into the first group exercise. And we'll focus that exercise on relevance and coverage and inclusion. Hopefully you'll have the guide readily available. We will present a scenario for each group. You'll have the same scenario across the groups, but for technical reasons, we'll share the scenario once you're in the group. So what I would like you to do is read the scenario, have the definitions of relevance and coverage and inclusion readily available, and discuss amongst yourself what an evaluation would examine under relevance and coverage and inclusion. And then, great if you can assign somebody in the group to report back. And what we would like you to do is to try to formulate and share one evaluation for each criterion. So one evaluation question for relevance and one for coverage and inclusion. You will have 20 minutes to do this, and the rooms will be randomly assigned. Don't be surprised if May, my colleague here at ALNAP, shows up in one of the rooms. She really wanted to do this group exercise as well. And if you have any questions, please, on the group exercise, please put these in the chat. You will have available in each room, you will have available these questions and the scenario. So no need to write down the questions. Those will be made available to you. And Rarimu, if I'm not mistaken, you're going to launch the groups. And then I thought we could quickly just check in with each group to hear what you came up with and maybe some key points from the discussions. So I'll start from the bottom, and room 4, which had Cherie, Evan, May, Melanie, Pauline, and Sharika. If you want to share some highlights from your discussions briefly, and the evaluation questions you came up with.
I can
Cherie.
I can jump in. We found it hard to unravel the difference between relevance and coverage. Not that we saw them, we understood that there was some nuance in terms of we thought of the coverage question being more kind of drilling down to like who is affected. And as for relevance, did I lose that question? I think I wrote it in I wrote the question in our chat and I think I lost it, but the question was around, the relevance question was around the how well designed the humanitarian assistance was to really inform how well designed the I left it in the chat. Sorry.
If I could help you there, does the
Yes.
design of the humanitarian assistance include well details to reach all types of the affected population? That
Yes.
was the gist of the question.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And we tried to drill down to coverage, and I think where we left coverage was we're going to talk about who if the relevant, like the most vulnerable people, and whether there were cultural considerations. So we're going to design a question around that and didn't quite get to it. So that's where our group left it.
Thank you so much, Cherie. I actually didn't mention this before the group exercise, but there was a reason why I picked those two, and that's because it can be quite confusing sometimes to differentiate between the two. And so I thought it would be interesting for you to work together a little bit on the differences. I'll move quickly on to group 2, and then when everyone's reported back, maybe I can try to give you like a short tagline explanation to keep those two different from each other. But we have group 2. Let me see who was in group 2. Where we had Aliyah, who joined late, Jan, Margaret, Stacey Ann, and Stacey Ann, and Susan. We were confused for a minute if there were 2 Stacey Anns or 1 Stacey Anns, but I think there's 2. So both were in the same group. Does anyone from that group want to share some highlights from the discussions and maybe challenges?
Sure. I can do that. Thank you, Sarah. We started talking quite a lot about the needs assessment that should have been done at the beginning, but we understood that the relief work already started before a proper assessment was done. And so we articulated around that, because also what was mentioned in the scenario is that the information collected by local people was not really used by the NEMA and Red Cross that were implementing the response. So that obviously became a problem, because then you have inappropriate material, etc., being distributed and not reaching everyone. So that's where the linkage was. So our first evaluation question is, to what extent was the information collected by local voices, or local voices in general, contributing to the design of the response? And was it according to the needs of the population? That is the relevance. And in terms of inclusion, we came up with, to what extent were the target groups properly defined, coming back to the needs assessment, and subsequently reached. For example, elderly, remote community people, and people with disabilities are mentioned. Probably also other target groups like children, or gender, looking at women or so. Those are the 2 questions we basically came up with.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jan. I wanted to pick up the point of needs assessment. I think it's very common in humanitarian action, and maybe you have experience from that from Haiti yourself, or others in the group might have experience of that as well. The needs assessments are either not done on time, or that they're not done properly, or that they're very surface level, or that they don't cover all relevant groups in the communities. And when you evaluate relevance, it's so important to pick up on that point, because if needs assessment have not been done properly, it is very often there's a big risk that the program has not been designed properly, because how can you design a program properly without knowing what the needs are? So needs assessments are really a key issue in evaluation of humanitarian action, and trying to understand what has been done in that regard or not, and the quality of the needs assessment. Thank you so much. We'll quickly move on to room 3, which had Eva, Caroline, Nadini, Joyce, Valessa, and Winston.
Good day, everyone. We did not have the opportunity to finish our discussions, but what I would say is that one point that jumped out at us or was spoken about was the importance of cultural relevance, and we kind of focused in on that, because the issue of cultural relevance will have some connection as well to the idea of inclusion and coverage, because we need to ensure that whatever intervention we do come up with is relevant to the persons, and based on their characteristics, the persons and their needs. But we also need to ensure that the intervention is inclusive of the different groups. So that was part of the discussion. But in terms of questions, we were about to complete our questions when we were closing off. So I have to ask whether my group
is okay with this. But I tried to pull two questions from what we discussed. One was, to what extent did the design and delivery match the needs based on the assessments that were done? Because we were saying that the information that we were given, we were not able to determine the detail of the assessment. So that was critical. And another question may have been, and this is where we were finishing off, to what extent did the interventions or the responses incorporate the cultural norms of the different groups represented in the demographics of the country? So those were some of the things that we came up with. You could add as we go along.
I wanted to add another question, given the sentence, the third sentence from the bottom, which says that some families felt that the relief items distributed was not well adapted. So I wanted to ask, how relevant is the relief provided to those in the shelters and host holdings? And that is because in the case of St. Vincent, which I was acquainted with, there were stories about, so the relief supplies were like food stuff, etc., that had to be cooked. But we don't have stoves and fridges within the shelters, or sufficient fridges and stoves. Is it that you can give food stuff as opposed to preparing meals to send to the shelters? So we're looking at the relevance of the actual supplies provided, because we weren't given any insight into what the supplies were, etc. But we heard that some persons were complaining that they weren't really well adapted to the crowded conditions.
Thank you so much, Ava and Nadine. I think that really reflects some of the key issues with relevance, and that in the design of the intervention, a decision can be made to distribute food, and that could be super relevant, but that at micro level, the type of food distributed or when the food is distributed, that could be an issue. So the overall decision, yes, we should distribute food to this affected community, that could be super relevant, that could be really meet the needs, but then you distribute the wrong kind of food, and that could be very contextual. One type of food might work in one context, but be completely irrelevant in another. And that's really something to explore when you're evaluating relevance in humanitarian context. So thank you so much to group 3, or to group, I lost, was that group 3? Sorry, I lost the track of which groups, but I think group 1.
Group 3.
Yes. So group 1 has not reported back yet, if I'm correct. And that's Alexandra, we have Katie, Melissa, Terence, and Valerie. If you want to just add quickly a few reflections from your group.
Okay, so the one that we spent the most time on was relevance, and we just wanted to understand to what degree the design was influenced by local needs, organizations, and the communities. And we thought it important to look at what constraints were there to ensuring that those local needs were well integrated into design. We also discussed, as we've been sharing here already, how the rapid assessment was done. Having some information on that could be helpful for improving any further response. And then for coverage, we just wanted to know, were all their groups affected reached, and which groups, if any, were excluded? Certainly understanding how the rapid assessment was done would also help us to understand that coverage issue a little bit more. So that was it from our group.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And hi, Karen. I've been calling you KT because that's what appeared on your screen, but nice to meet you. I just wanted to put in the chat just like a shorthand explanation of the difference between the two. So relevance focuses on whether humanitarian action is doing the right thing, and coverage on who has been reached. So very much relevance is the what, and the coverage and inclusion is the who. So I think that's perhaps a slightly simplified, but a good way to remember the difference between the two. We are running a little bit behind schedule, but we'll now take a couple of minute break, a comfort break, or if you want to grab a cup of tea or grab some water. So I'll let you all take a couple of minute break and we'll be back in 3 minutes. So that's 27 after the hour. And if I'm not mistaken, in Jamaica, that'll be 11:27. See you soon. Let's start again. So welcome back from your mini break. It was really super short. Yes, Pauline, if you could not hear us, we were on a break, but hopefully you can hear me now. We'll quickly move on to two other criteria, and I would say these are maybe the trickiest criteria, mostly because they're not, they're obviously not that well known and not the most commonly used criteria. Interconnection is specific to humanitarian action, and then the second criterion that we'll take a look at is coherence, which is now part of the core suite that the OECD DAC recommends, but is still, I think, a criterion that creates quite a lot of confusion. So in our guide, we decided to rename connectedness, which was created in the 90s, into interconnection. As I mentioned before, just for ease of understanding, and also because connectedness can be quite difficult to translate into other languages. So the key question that we pose with interconnection is if humanitarian action takes account of the medium and longer term, and how does it connect with development and peace building? This means that interconnection has two dimensions. One is the temporal dimension, the time dimension, which is if short-term humanitarian action is designed, planned, and implemented to take into account medium and longer-term considerations. Just as a quick example, very often in humanitarian action, one might use community volunteers, and some organizations have a policy to pay those volunteers, and that can create issues in the long term if there is a health system or other services which are based on volunteers not being paid. And so humanitarian organizations coming in and paying volunteers can create a lot of issues and challenges in those relationships with volunteers in terms of expectancies if they're paid by humanitarian organizations, but not by other stakeholders who act more in the medium and longer term. So that's just a quick example of what that could entail. And then the second dimension of interconnection is the relational dimension. And that means if humanitarian action connects appropriately to development and peace building. As some of you know, humanitarian actors have a tendency sometimes to not want to step out of their humanitarian bubble and to speak to actors and institutions and governments who are acting in the long term and or for peace building action. And so interconnection is really about exploring if humanitarian actors have made that connection to development and peace building actors and kind of thought about what does it mean, what repercussions could it have that we do not consider the environment that we work within in terms of what other actors are doing. Next slide, please, Hamam. So as I mentioned, the other criterion that I wanted us to explore a little bit more is coherence. It's, as I mentioned now several times, it's part of the official OECD DAC suite, but we've defined it a little bit differently. So in our definition, we ask ourselves how complementary, coordinated, and consistent humanitarian action is across different actors. So coherence refers to complementarity and coordination of humanitarian action between actors engaged in humanitarian work. As I mentioned before, humanitarian actors have a tendency to not step out of their humanitarian bubble, but they also have a tendency to not speak to each other. And coordination and complementarity is often a big challenge in humanitarian action, especially in sudden onset crisis, where actors do their thing without really consulting or talking to other organizations. And then the second dimension of coherence is the policy and standard dimension. This means if the action is aligned with and consistent with policies and standards, and that could be both within an organization, but also at system-wide levels within the humanitarian system. Next slide, please. So we'll go into a second group exercise focusing on coherence and interconnection. But before we do that, I just wanted to quickly mention the 3 priority themes. Because as I mentioned before, in addition to the criteria in the guide, we also introduce 3 priority themes. We'll not have time to really explore those in detail, but they're very important, and they're kind of, for me, they're really key questions that all humanitarian actors should consider at this time. And the first one is putting affected people at the center. The second one is locally led humanitarian action. And the third one is environment and climate crisis. Next slide, please. Yes. So in the guide, we have some key messages for each of these priority themes. I won't go through them in detail, but for the first one, putting people affected by crisis at the center, it does revolve a lot around dynamics of power and trust between humanitarian actors and affected people. It has to do a lot with cultural sensitivity and adapting to the context. And it also means for the evaluation process for the evaluators and the commissioners to really put affected people at the center of the evaluation. Sometimes we have a tendency to forget that all that we're doing is for the benefit of affected people. And so even for evaluators, it can be important to get that reminder that affected people should be at the center of the evaluation process. Next slide, please. The second theme that we really highlight in the guide is locally led humanitarian action. That is very much linked to local actors' leadership or lack thereof in humanitarian action, and how the evaluation can explore the role that local actors have had in the response, and the relation between international actors and local actors, or even regional, national actors with local actors. And it's always important to remember that local actors are not a homogeneous group, and it can be very important to consider the variation within this group, the power dynamics, how they relate to the population affected by crisis, and if there are certain actors who have been hindered in providing support to affected people. Last slide before group work is environment and climate crisis. This was somewhat of a controversial theme, actually, for the guide and the feedback we received on the first draft. But for us, it was important to highlight that we, as everyone else on this planet, we cannot be blind to the consequences of the climate crisis and environmental issues, and that there are consequences not only for the response of the climate crisis, but there are also consequences of how humanitarian actors mitigate or do not mitigate the climate crisis in their activities. We also highlight the importance of considering local and indigenous knowledge, practice, and solutions when it comes to the environment and climate crisis, and if these have been taken into account by the humanitarian response. So I went through these priority themes quite quickly, so apologies for that. But if you're curious and want to know more about these 3 themes, I would really invite you to explore them in the guide. Next slide, please. So we'll now quickly jump into the second group work. You'll recognize the structure. It's basically the same exercise, but with 2 new criteria. So I hope you weren't too fatigued by the first group work. You'll get a new scenario and the chance to explore interconnection and coherence. And if you find it difficult or challenging, no one is gonna test you at the end of this. So if you get stuck on one criterion, don't worry. I just really want you to have the chance to explore the criteria at your ease. So don't stress. And once again, you will have 20 minutes, although we might bring you back a bit earlier just because we're running behind schedule. But you'll get advance notice of when we'll close the room, so don't worry. Warim, Humam, maybe you can stop sharing this. Warimu, you can launch the rooms and share the second scenario. I think everyone is back. Welcome back from the discussions. Apologies if you can hear a very loud call for prayer. I'm based in Tunis, and with Ramadan, they've turned up the volume on the call for prayer, so it's very loud behind me. But hopefully, you can still hear me clearly. So we just have a few minutes left. I would invite the groups to put your evaluation questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we will not have time to have everyone debrief, but maybe a couple of people would want to share some thoughts, challenges, difficulties, or just general reflections on these two criteria. If there are any volunteers to share just some thoughts from either one of the groups.
Well, I had a challenge, Sarah,
Yes,
in
please.
terms of the applicability
Mm.
of the interconnectedness, and which is the other one we're doing. If it's
Coherence.
such a short term, coherence is fine because that was what the interconnection. Interconnection, you're talking about moving from short to medium to long term. And the boundary of this project is very short term. It's very to go in, emergency response, do whatever, provide whatever is needed for an immediate response. And to be asking the questions of that linkage to the medium and long term actions that are being taken by other agencies that may be in there, I do have a challenge wrapping that around in my head. The boundary of this project is short term to go in a specific objective. I could see it related to the parent question,
Yes,
but the interconnection.
I think it is a bit more abstract, maybe, than some of the other criteria. So I completely understand the challenges of fully understanding what interconnection relates to. But I think for me, the way I think about it is that humanitarian action, even if it's short term, does not take place in a void, and that in all contexts, there are other considerations at play, even if it could be easy to think that, well, the most important thing is for people to get their immediate needs met. Those needs are met in a context which is influenced by other considerations, which are more long-term. and which is also influenced by other actors. For example, if I may just give one example, I worked for a few years in Burkina Faso in West Africa, where I worked with development aid, so more on the long-term perspective. At the same time, there was a huge humanitarian crisis happening. So even in related to conflict and displacement, it was a displacement crisis. So even in countries where there are huge humanitarian crises which can seem that are very acute, there are other actors working on long-term development issues. And so I think it is important for evaluators and humanitarian actors to take that into account, that no humanitarian action takes place in the void, and that it's important to understand the linkages to the context and environment and everything else that happens around humanitarian actors. With that said, I don't think it's relevant to apply interconnection in every single context, in every single humanitarian evaluation, but it can be interesting in some context to analyze issues related to interconnection. I'll just as with the first group work, I'll put kind of a shorthand of the difference between the two, and hopefully that can also clarify the differences. We've now gone over time, so maybe I won't invite anyone else to speak. I'm a stickler for time management. I do want to thank you for your participation throughout the session. I hope it's been rewarding for you. It's certainly been that for me. If you're interested in staying in touch with us at ALNAP, you can use the QR code on the left on the screen to sign up for our monthly bulletin. So you'll receive the ALNAP General Monthly Bulletin, but you'll also be on our email M&E list, and you'll receive M&E specific news from ALNAP. And if you're not able to open the QR code, there's also a link in the chat a bit higher up. I want to shout out my communication colleagues Homam and Warimu who helped out today. And I also want to shout out May, who's in the Philippines, where it's 1 a.m. And I think she's still online with us, or she was until recently. So really big thank you to my colleagues for helping out. Big thank you to CEI for hosting these two sessions with us. It's been super interesting to meet all of you. I do hope we'll have other opportunities to partner. Please stay in touch with us and visit our website. And I'll also put my email address in the chat in case you want to get in touch with me specifically. And if you want more information or have more questions on the guide, on humanitarian evaluations, please don't hesitate to reach out. With that, I'll hand back over to Valerie. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, May. We are very, very pleased that we could do this two-part series. I know everybody here gained a lot from this. And certainly, as we said before, it will be online on the YouTube channel, as is the other, the part one. We'll share those links again. Thank you, Sarah, and your team. We will certainly partner again in the very near future, maybe nearer than you might want it. Anyway, just pointing out, next week on March the 5th, there is a regional workshop hosted by ClearLake in collaboration with, I think, the Caribbean Development Bank. We are encouraging folks to get online and join this workshop, Tools for Diagnosing and Strengthening M&E Systems in the Caribbean. It concerns all of us, and we certainly want to have, want to hear what the panel has to say and want to make our inputs known. With that, I'm following Sarah's lead. No further delays. I will close off. Thanks, everybody, and have a blessed day.